Welcome to the Eye Opener. I'm your host, Michael Lewis. On February 4th, Joe Biden gave his first foreign policy speech. His speech was seen as setting the tone for his foreign policy. In the speech, Biden declared that America is back. So let's take a look at what exactly America is back to. Before his official speech, Biden gave a speech to the staff of the U.S. State Department. He established several goals. The first is to rebuild America's alliances. He was alluding to the fact that former President Trump had offended America's allies in the previous 4 years. His second goal is to re-engage actively with the world. Since he took office, he has reversed many of former President Trump's policies, such as rejoining the World Health Organization, the Paris Climate Agreement, and the United Nations Human Rights Council. Thirdly, he said he would deal with the pandemic and climate change. He stressed in his fourth goal that he would fight for democracy and human rights all over the world. Let us see how he's going to fight. In a formal foreign policy speech, Biden pointed out the need to stop aid to a Saudi-backed armed coalition in Yemen. The U.S. had been supporting this coalition in fighting the Iranian-backed Houthi rebels. The move was interpreted by critics as a big gift to Iran. But Biden's reasons for withdrawing the aid was that the armed conflict in Yemen had created humanitarian catastrophe. Additionally, Biden also announced that the new Defense Secretary, Lloyd Austin, will conduct an assessment of the global distribution of U.S. forces to ensure that the deployment of U.S. forces is in line with the current administration's priorities. My biggest concern is that Trump's administration had previously worked hard to pull U.S. troops out of wars in the Middle East, including some individual countries in Europe. His purpose was to concentrate the forces in the Asia-Pacific region to confront the Chinese Communist Party. Since Biden took office, I wonder if former President Trump's strategy will be uprooted. If he does do that, he is destroying a big accomplishment achieved by the former administration. In today's speech, Biden has announced that he will terminate former President Trump's troop withdrawal plan from Germany. Biden also mentioned that he would not give in easily to Russia and condemned the military coup in Burma. He also mentioned raising the admission cap of the U.S. refugee intake. When former President Trump was in office, the refugee intake had dropped sharply to 15,000 refugees per year. Biden plans to increase the cap to 125,000 persons. At the same time, President Biden stressed that this series of action is intended to restore America's position in the world. Regarding the CCP, Biden's opinion differs from that of the Trump administration. Trump described the CCP as the greatest threat to the United States and the world. In his speech, Biden simply said that the CCP regime is the most serious competitor to the United States. The former referred to it as a military enemy, while the latter softened his tone and called it a competitor in areas other than military affairs. Biden said he wants to resist the CCP's economic violations, but at the same time says that the United States is ready to work with Beijing as long as it is in the interest of the United States. However, the Biden administration also revealed that it may continue to put pressure on the CCP on trade. Firstly, he will not easily withdraw the tariffs imposed by Trump. Second, new tariffs may have to be planned for products from China. The Biden administration also wants to give Wall Street firms like Goldman Sachs more access to the Chinese market. According to Fox News, Biden's priority is dealing with China's trade abuses that hurt American workers. However, according to information from Biden administration officials, the overall policy towards China is still strategic patience. As Biden also mentioned, his intention to negotiate with CCP, Matthew Pottinger, a former deputy national security advisor in the Trump administration, warned to not fall for the trap. CCP is very good at delaying tactics, and one of the key tactics of the Trump administration was not allowing the CCP to stretch out the negotiation period for too long. Before the Trump administration, the U.S. had many negotiations with the CCP, but with little success, and the CCP's aggressive stance was gradually escalating. The Biden administration's confusing stance centered around strategic patience towards China reeks of weakness, and the CCP can smell it. China's top diplomat Yang Jiechi warned the Biden administration not to cross Beijing's red line in a half-hour speech on Monday evening. If you have been following the show, then you know a couple of days ago, we touched on a Vision Time article that compared the Chinese Communist Party to a two-headed beast. One head is a panda and the other a wolf. The point we were making was when former President Trump was in office, Both heads were useless, but after Biden took power, the Chinese Communist Party started using its panda head. But sure enough, right on cue, the CCP reared its wolf head. The CCP's top diplomat went on to say, the United States should stop interference in the affairs of Hong Kong, Tibet, and Xinjiang. Yang called the issue regarding the three regions China's internal affairs. Yang also added, they constitute a red line that must not be crossed. Any trespassing would end up undermining China-US relations and the United States' own interests. He also told the United States that it should strictly abide by the One China principle with regards to Taiwan, a self-ruled island that Beijing claims to be part of its territory. Now, this level of posturing was absolutely unheard of when Trump administration was in power. Right up to Trump's last day in office, the CCP kept their paper tiger tails between their legs and dared not speak out of turn. The Trump administration confronted China on its human rights violation against Falun Gong adherents, Hong Kongers, Tibetans, and Uyghurs by imposing visa restrictions and sanctions against CCP officials responsible for the abuse. Additionally, former U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo designated CCP's persecution of Uyghurs and other majority Muslim ethnic minorities as genocide and crimes against humanity on the eve of Biden's inauguration. Yang asked the Biden administration to restore the U.S.-China relationship to a predictable and constructive track of development. He named areas in which he said the two countries could cooperate, including drug control and cybersecurity. Now, the reality is China is the largest source of illicit fentanyl and fentanyl-like substances in the United States. According to a 2018 report by the U.S.-China Economic and Security Review Commission. According to data from the U.S. National Institute on Drug Abuse, there were 70,630 drug overdose deaths in the United States in 2019. The majority of the deaths related to the use of fentanyl. Fentanyl is 100 times more potent than morphine and 50 times more powerful than heroin. As little as 2 milligrams is considered a lethal dosage for most people. In 2020, Trump's administration sanctioned several Chinese nationals and a Chinese company for fentanyl trafficking. U.S.-based China affairs commentator Tang Xingyang said in a phone interview that the Chinese regime was using both soft and hard tactics to pressure the administration in the hopes of restarting official talks with the United States. Young's speech could be read as an indication that the Chinese regime would be willing to make concessions if the United States promises not to cross their red lines. Ultimately, Tang believes the Chinese regime is willing to revert back to a time when human rights and commerce were decoupled from each other, so that the regime could continue to do business with the United States while continuing its atrocities. Ignoring human rights violation is exactly what the CCP wants the world to do. If we could all come to a sober realization of the level of barbarity being done to people in China, this awareness alone could add pressure to the ferocious and malevolent regime. On February 3rd, BBC reported that Tursunay Ziawudun, a native of Xinjiang, was detained for 9 months in an internment camp. She revealed the hellish situation there. Women were taken out of their cells every night and raped by one or more masked officers dressed in suits. Ziawudun is a victim herself, and she didn't want to talk about it until it was necessary to reveal this disgusting truth. She said some of the women were taken away and never returned, and the officers threatened them not to tell anyone. All they could do in the camps was to be silently tortured. Many of them who were tortured had mental breakdowns. The report also mentioned a horrific case. Chinese Communist police officers asked one victim to help persecute another. It is beyond human comprehension how distorted the souls of these police officers were. A Kazakh woman named Galshir Akman was forced to strip another Uyghur woman in the camp and then handcuffed her. Another Uzbek woman, Galbanir Sadek, revealed that she was teaching Chinese in the camp. During teaching, she could hear the screams of women being tortured outside. Some of the screams were from the police officers inserting electrified shock wands into the woman's genital tracts. The screams could be heard throughout the building. The Chinese Communist authorities will never allow unauthorized media or individuals to report these things. Foreign media will be pressured if they attempt to reveal the issues. Recently, the Chinese Communist authorities labeled BBC as fake news for its reporting on the pandemic in China and then demanded an apology from the BBC. As a result, the UK announced on February 4th that the UK Communication Regulatory had officially revoked the broadcasting license of CCP state media CGTN in their country. In fact, this decision was already foreshadowed, so the CCP demanded for an apology from BBC was seen as a retaliation. These tragic stories are just the tip of the iceberg under the Chinese Communist rule. In Xinjiang, Tibet, and all over China, such things take place all the time. Of course, these stories are censored by the mainstream media for the reasons we all know. In another recent case, a human rights activist in China named Guo Feizhang was caught and imprisoned by the CCP when he tried to reunite with his wife, who resides in the US and is seriously ill. After being detained, Guo had been on a hunger strike for several days. Guo had defended many victims of human rights violations in China, including Falun Gong practitioners. He demanded CCP officials to disclose their assets, criticized press censorship, and for all these reasons, Guo had been a thorn in the eyes of the communist authorities and brutally suppressed. Guo spent 11 years in prison in the past 15 years, where he endured various means of tortures, including electric shock, force feeding, and beatings. Now, about 20 senior intellectuals in China have signed an open letter to Xi Jinping and Li Keqiang and other top Chinese officials demanding Guo's release. I hope more people around the world will support Guo and call for his release, allowing him to unite with his wife in the US. Now, before we move on, I once again would like to make two requests. First, our videos are being removed and demonetized. So if you enjoy the show, please consider supporting us. Our donor box link is in the description. And secondly, the censorship continues to be excessively restrictive. And if we get shut down, it would be great, as a safety measure, if you would please sign up to our email list. Okay, let's get back into it. On February 4th, the New York Post reported on an article by a four-star Admiral Charles Richard in the U.S. Naval Institution's monthly magazine. The article pointed, there is a real possibility that a regional crisis with Russia or China could escalate quickly to a conflict involving nuclear weapons. If they perceived a conventional loss would threaten the regime or state. He then urged the U.S. military to shift its principal assumption from nuclear employment is not possible to nuclear employment is a very real possibility, and act to meet and deter that reality. This would be the first time in U.S. history that the United States would face two nuclear-capable adversaries. In early January 2021, Xi Jinping ordered the entire military to begin training in mobilization, telling them to use Xi ideology as their guide and focus on preparing for war. Meanwhile, the CCP's new national defense law, which took effect in January, states that the CCP's so-called conditions for war are met when the national development interests are threatened. But on January 30th, New York Times columnist Nicholas Kristof wrote that a U.S.-China war may not happen, but a military conflict is possible. The location of the conflict could be in the Pratas or Kinmen Islands. Both are in Taiwan's territory. The CCP could also use submarines to cut Taiwan's undersea cables, block oil deliveries, or disrupt Taiwan's banking system with cyber attacks. With a full-scale invasion of Taiwan is not necessarily possible, a conflict in Pratas or Kinmen is highly likely. Nicholas Kristof believes that the Biden administration may want to restrain the hegemonic Xi Jinping on one hand and cooperate with Beijing on issues such as climate, drug, and North Korea on the other. There is a great deal of uncertainty as to whether the CCP can be effectively restrained. At the same time, Biden's rise to power has been accompanied by chaos in the United States. First, the Democratic Party's impeachment fiasco on former President Trump. It is rumored that the Democratic Party has called on former President Trump to testify at his second impeachment trial. In the southern border of the United States, Custom and Border Protection agents are currently arresting more than 3,000 illegal immigrants every day. Even agents who have worked on Border Patrol for decades say it's very scary. New figures show that Biden is now opening up the border on a larger scale than he did under Obama, and that illegal immigration is at its highest level in recent years. And California's Governor Newsom is facing removal from office because people are unhappy with his policies on pandemic control. The number of signatures for the petition has now reached 1.4 million, with only 100,000 left before the threshold of 1.5 million. If the threshold is reached, California will hold a recall election to oust Newsom from office. On February 3rd, Republican Congressman from Florida, Matt Gaetz, was interviewed by Steve Bannon-hosted podcast War Room Pandemic. In the interview, he said he was willing to defend former President Trump in the impeachment trial with everything he has, even if he has to give up his seat to do so. The House Committee on Ethics previously told Gaetz that he must give up his seat before he can go to the Senate to help defend Trump on February 8th. Gaetz believes that because some Republicans are worried about losing some centrists, those who should be defending Trump are afraid to speak up. Gaetz said he loves his district and values his seat in Congress, but he said, if the president called me and wanted me to go defend him on the floor of the Senate, that would be the top priority in my life. I would leave my House seat, I would leave my home, and I would do anything I had to ensure that the greatest president in my lifetime got a full-throated defense. The U.S. Senate will begin hearing the House's impeachment case against Trump next Monday. 45 Republican senators have already expressed that the second impeachment of former President Trump by Congress is unconstitutional. People on the outside also believe that this impeachment by the Democrats will end in failure. The U.S. Senate impeachment trial against former President Donald Trump will begin on February 8th. Bruce Castor, who's the defense attorney in the impeachment case, said the former president has every reason to win the impeachment. In a recent interview with Radio.com, Bruce Castor said there was no connection between former President Trump's actions on January 6 and the alleged incitement to riot. He doesn't believe the Democrats have any evidence to prosecute former President Trump. On February 2nd, some leftists said the former President Trump should plead guilty in the impeachment case to prevent him from taking public office again. Bruce Castor and another lawyer on Trump's defense team, David Schoen, filed papers in response to the House impeachment on February 2nd. They said that the House impeachment of former President Trump was unconstitutional because he no longer holds public office. Furthermore, the First Amendment of the U.S. Constitution gives former President Trump the right to express his views on the 2020 election. On February 3rd, 45 Republican lawmakers also said the Senate's actions violates the U.S. Constitution. If the Senate were to convict former President Trump, it would require the approval of two-thirds majority to do so. With 45 Republican senators opposing, the chance of convictions are basically zero. Well, that's it for today, my friends. Please like and share, and if you haven't, please subscribe, and I'll see you next time.